The Fastest Gun Dead by Julian F. Grow. This story appeared in Worlds of If, Science Fiction, March of 1961. Extensive research by Project Gutenberg did not uncover any evidence that the U.S. copyright on this was renewed. Dead by Julian F. Grow. This story appeared in Worlds of If, Science Fiction, March of 1961. Extensive research by Project Gutenberg did not uncover any evidence that the U.S. copyright on this was renewed. He was a big man, broad of shoulder, slim of hip. His Stetson was crimped Texas style over slate-gray eyes that impassively had seen much good and more evil in their 26 years. He stood in the saloon door with the dust of the streets of Dos Cervezas range riders' chaps. His left hand held open the weather-beaten swinging door. The right hovered over the worn peachwood butt of the Colt holstered on his right thigh. The slate-gray eyes, emotionless, swept the crowd bellied up to the bar and stopped at one man. When he spoke, it was flat, but with the ring of tempered steel, and every man but that one drew back out of range. "I want you, Dirty Jake," the big man said. "Now." Dirty Jake shot him into doll rags, naturally. Mittelmeyer was, you might say, the most feared ribbon clerk in the territory. Easily the most. I remember him from the early days. From the first day he came to town, in fact. I remember because he got off the stage just as I was leaning out the window nailing up my brand new shingle, and my office next to the stage depot. I was down on the boardwalk admiring it, all shiny gold leaf on black like the correspondence school promised. Hiram Pertwee, M.D. His voice broke in on me all squeaky. "Beg your pardon," he said, D. His voice broke in on me all squeaky. "Beg your pardon," he said. "Where's the YMCA?" Well, that isn't the usual sort of question for here. I turned around. There he was, a scrawny little runt about a Panama hat, a wrinkled linen duster, and Congress gaiters. He wasn't especially dirty then, of course, only about average for a stage passenger. He kind of begrudged his face, with little squint eyes and a long thin nose, a mustache like a hank of Spanish moss, and just about chin enough duster. He wore a clawhammer coat, the only alpaca one I ever saw, and I never from that day out saw him wear any other. He stood there looking like he'd never been any place he really cottoned to, but this might just be the worst. I was just a young squirt then and not above funnin' a dude. I told him the YMCA was around the corner, 2 doors down and up the back stairs at the Owl Hoot Palace. He nodded and went the way I told him. That was, and still is, Kate's 4-bit crib. The girl halfway to the knee, and their shirtwaists are open at the neck. Dirty Jake didn't speak to me for 3 years. He wasn't Dirty Jake then, though just Jacob Needlemeyer, fresh from selling ribbons and yard goods in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and hot to find a fortune in the hills. His natural life. This was a new beginning for a man 34 who was already at the bitter end and looking for the path back. Gold was the way, he figured. He was going to get it. But he didn't. He was back flat broke and starving in 4 months. He spent the next 17 years behind the notions counter at Martin's Mercantile, selling ribbon and yard goods and growing old 2 years at a time. I think it tainted his mind. Leastways, from the time I got to know him, some 14 years gone, at first, when the store closed at sundown, he'd take off for the near hills with a pick and a sack, still seeking for color somebody might have missed. After a while, he didn't bother with the gear. He just moseyed around all that rock mostly, I suppose, to be away from people. Truth to tell, people from people. Truth to tell, people were beginning to avoid him anyway. He was getting kind of gamey over the years, and cantankerous generally. Maybe it's kind of funny we got more or less friendly, but doctors and ribbon clerks aren't so all fired far apart. They both have to do with people and their ways, and like to get shut of both now and then. Every couple of months I'd go along with him up into the hills to get the sick smell out of my nose. Night air and a night sky pretty fine if you've been looking at tongues and such long enough. Getting out like that, we didn't say much. I preferred it that way since Jake Needlemeyer was a boob. A smart man can get on tolerably well with an idiot, if both just have sense enough to keep their mouths shut. Why? He got started and was going on to beat the band yapping about how life was a cheat, and someday everybody'd respect Jacob Needlemeyer until finally I lost patience, and I told him that while I treasured our association beyond pearls, I'd chuck him off a cliff if he didn't shut the hell up. I'd chuck him off a cliff if he didn't shut the hell up. I was nice about it, and after that it was, like I said, tolerable. Well, sir, about 2 years ago he came into my office while I was darning up some fool borax miner that had got his teeth while I finished. After the borax miner limped out, he spoke up. "Coming?" That was all the invitation he ever gave. "I guess," I said. I sloshed the suture needle in a basin, gave it a couple of swipes on the hone stone, and threw it in my satchel. That miner had a... Jake went out first. I closed the door behind us, not locking it, of course, because our night marshal was kind of my relief surgeon whenever I was on calls. He was a Secesh hospital orderly during the rebellion. He was better with a saw than with sewing, but he could tie up most wounds well enough to do till I got back. Jake and I set out south up the mountain trail, but pretty soon it hit me he was heading someplace considerable more directly than we usually did. Sure enough, he took off at an angle from the trail after a bit. We struck up into some fairly woolly country. He wasn't following any sign I could see, at least not by moonlight, but he kept going faster until I was plumb out of wind. We were in the hills overlooking Crater Lake when we came to a kind of an amphitheater in the rocks, some 20 feet across. He stopped at the edge of it and stood staring in, silent and breathing catchy. I just chased my own breath for a while, then looked too and saw what he was aiming at. Right and pale in the moonshine like nothing else does was a pile of old bones. Jake, I saw, had seen it before. It was scaring him yet. Old bones, sir, are still bones. I've seen and set my fill, but after I got a good look at these, they scared me together, all nicely preserved, and only 3 of 'em were men. Injuns, I mean. You could tell that from the shreds of buckskin. 2 of them still had weapons near their right hands, one a stone knife, the other a lance, and the top of each of the 3 skulls had been shot clean away. At least half of the top, almost the entire os frontal and ossa paritalia on the left side was gone on each one. I hunkered down to see closer while Jake stood back and shook. I struck a sulfur match and saw something else about those 3 redskin skulls, while Jake stood back and shook. I struck a sulfur match and saw something else about those 3 redskin skulls. The edges where the bone was gone weren't fractured clean like a bullet or club would do. They were charred. The 3 were more or less man-shaped, but it wasn't a man, that I know. I don't believe I care to find out what it was. Instead of ribs, there was a cylinder of thin bone, and it had only 1 bone in the lower leg. What there was for a pelvis I've never seen was straight out of a Doré Bible. There was a hatchet buried in that skull. The bones of the right arm were good and hefty, and it had 2 elbows. The left arm was about half the size, not crippled, but smaller scale, like it was good for delicate work and not much else. About 10 inches from the widespread 6 fingers of its right hand was what you knew right off was a weapon, even if it did look like an umbrella handle. I was just reaching down to touch it when that fool Jake made his move. He'd been standing behind me, closer I bet than he'd ever got before, staring down at that 4th skeleton and making odd noises. I tell you, it was something for a medical man to see. Suddenly, he grunted like he was going to be sick. He snatched up a femur from one of the engines. He snatched up a femur from one of the engines and swung it up to smash that 4th skeleton to smithereens. Well, sir, quicker than the eye could see, the umbrella handle smacked itself into the palm of that bony hand, sending fingers flying in 6 directions. It hung there in the air against what was left, trained dead on Jake's head, and it hummed. The femur dropped from Jake's right hand like he'd been shot. He hadn't, though, because he was still wearing his skull, and by that time running. Soon dying away. When it stopped, the place was pretty quiet, because Jake was off in the rocks, and I was going over some things I wanted to say to him. Immediately I was able to talk again. That 4th skeleton had the fastest draw I'd ever seen. Jake stuck his head up from behind a boulder. "Talk," he said. "Why didn't he shoot?" The question wasn't as all-fired pip-witted as Jake was capable of. It took me upwards of 3 weeks to work out why a weapon that could draw and aim itself didn't shoot, too. I'd heard a little clink when the weapon flew into the skeleton's hand. It came from a metal disc that lay in its palm toward the heel of the hand. The disc was thin and only about a mate to it was set in the butt of the umbrella handle, convex where the other was concave. Going at it kind of gingerly, I slid the disc in my vest behind my watch and put the umbrella handle in my right coat pocket. It was a key-wind repeater with a gold hunting case, that watch, and I worried about it every step down the mountain. I walked a good 400 yards behind Jake all the way back into town, just to be on the safe side. We didn't linger either. We wanted lights. My heartbeat and anybody else would have had me telling the sexton to start his hole. I prescribed bed for me, told Jake, who hadn't hardly even drawn breath the whole time, to go to hell, and retired. Next day, a squabble came up over some borax time. Then one early morning, coming back in the buggy from a house call in Pockmark, 40-odd miles north, I got to worrying again at the umbrella handle and those dead engines. Seems like 4 or 5 times a week some chunkhead hunkers down hard with his spurs on. When I got to the office that night, there was one waiting. A bad one, Spanish rowels, and Jake was sprawled in my chair picking his teeth with my spare scalpel. Patched up the chunkhead, took the scalpel from Jake and rinsed it off, and watched him suck his teeth for a while. It began to look like he was going to be stubborn. So finally I said, "Say, Jake." He grunted. "Jake," I said, "I think I got that dingus figured." He snuck a glance over at the desk, so I knew he knew what I meant, but that wasn't what he came to talk about. "I think it's a gun that can read minds like a gypsy," I said. Jake still looked bored, so I took the umbrella handle out of the roll top and waved it at him. He dove off the chair and started rolling for the door. You damn fool, I said. You damn fool, I said. It won't go off. I was reasonably certain it wouldn't, but I laid it back down by the disc gently anyhow and sat in the chair. I've only got the one chair, on the theory that anybody who isn't bad enough to lie on the table is stood like a short-legged bird on a barbed wire fence. It can what? He said. It can read minds, I said. You were going to bash those bones, the gun knew it and trained square on your head, you remember? He remembered. And those engines, I went on. You remember them? The lead was blown off. I hauled down a roller chart of the human skeleton. First time I'd done that since I don't know when. This up here is the brain, I said. We don't know a hell of a lot about it, but we do know it's like a whole room full of telegraphers, sending messages. We don't know a hell of a lot about it, but we do know it's like a whole room full of telegraphers, sending messages to different parts of the body along the nerves. They're like the wires. This left hemisphere right here sends to the right side of the body. Don't fret about why. The nerves twist going into the spinal cord. Too, that the part of the brain that sends to the arm is right here in the parietal lobe, right under the chunk of skull that was shot off on those 3 Indians. Shaw? Jake said, perching on the table. The old billy goat was beginning to get impressed, even if he didn't have any notion of what I was talking about. I didn't have exactly much notion either, but I kept on. The brain works by a kind of electricity, same kind as in the telegraph batteries at the depot. This gun, I tapped the umbrella handle and Jake started off again, but caught himself, has some sort of detector, a galvanic thermometer that senses electrical messages to the nerves. From here on in, it was pure dark and wild hazard. Obviously, I said, whenever one of those signals goes from this cerebral motor, the weapon hand move, it must be a special signal this gun was built to catch, just like a lock is made for one particular key. As near as I can figure, the gun has to be able to tell when that move coming up is going to be dangerous to the man holding it. Stands to reason if it can tell when a brain's sick, that brain is killing mad. Some people can do that, and most dogs. So if it senses murderous intent and a message to the weapon hand to move, it moves too, and faster. It homes on this disc like a magnet right into the hand of the gent that owns it, and aims itself plumb at the hand of the gent that owns it, and aims itself plumb at the place the signal is coming from. I tapped the chart. Right here. I poked the gunk out of a corncob, packed it, and lit up before going on. Jake stared at the umbrella handle like a stuffed owl. Now that 4th skeleton we saw sure as hell isn't human. He isn't from anywhere on this green earth, or I miss my guess. Might even have something to do with Crater Lake there years ago, but we aren't likely to find out. His gun before he fell. That brought Jake up short. The territory is kind of violent generally, and anybody or anything good along that line would be bound to have the sober respect of a ninny like Jake. I dug up an old glove and used spirit gum to stick in its palm the little disc from the skeleton's hand. I pulled the glove on my right hand and stood up with my hand about a foot over the umbrella handle. He was so ory-eyed by then he damn near did it just to be obliging. But then the recollection of the night on the mountain and the 3 Injuns with their heads shot off sifted through, and he shied off. "Hell no," he hollered. "I seen that thing go before. I ain't about to get my head blowed to bits." And he went on. Well, it took me the best of 2 hours. I showed him the 2 studs on the underside that most likely were a safety device. I explained how probably the gun wouldn't go off, unless somebody was holding it with a finger between those studs, which was why I didn't shoot when it went into the skeleton's hand that night. I finally got him by telling him if I was right, we'd wire the fourth skeleton together, take it back east, and earn a mint of money on the vaudeville stage showing the fastest cadaver in the West. Better than Billy the Kid and twice as dead, I said we'd bill it. Jake, he thought that was a lovely idea and decided to go along. 14 times that eternal jackass raised his right arm at me, while I held my own gloved right hand over the weapon. But he didn't have any real heart for it, and 14 times the gun just lay there. Then I got him mighty impatient and kicked him in the kneecap. That 15th time he was truly trying. Skinny as he was, he'd have driven me clear through the floor, except that I'm glove and aimed dead at his forehead, snarling like a cougar. More correctly, the left side of his forehead. If I hadn't braced my index finger out stiff, that 15th time would have had him a dead man. Jake froze like a statue and hung in the air, staring at the gun. Finally, I pulled the glove off with the gun still stuck to it and flung it onto the desk. Then Jake gave me the 16th, and by the time I got up again, he was gone, and the gun and the glove with him. Next morning, the borax squabble blew up again. What with miners getting stomped, I didn't get to bed for a week, much less have a chance to find out where Jake and that damned weapon had lit out for. By the time I did, it was too late. Jacob Needlemeyer, the ribbon clerk, after 17 years, was on his way to glory as the legendary Dirty Jake. I got the start of the story from a drifter named Hubert Comus. He'd got into kind of a heated discussion in a saloon south a ways that ended with him for their hardware. Hubert got his Merwin and Bray 42 out and, being a fool, tried fanning it. Of course it jammed, and he laid the heel of his hand open clear to the bone. 'Twasn't the hand bothering Hubert, though. Like most, the other man missed him clean. But when the barkeep threw them both out, Hubert lit sitting on the boardwalk and took a 6-inch splinter clear through his corduroys. While I was working on him, he told me about Jake. A man, it seems, had turned up in a little settlement called Blister about 2 days down the line. Nobody noticed him come in, except that he was wearing one glove, a shiny clawhammer coat, and Congress gaiters. The general run in the mining camps don't wear Congress gaiters. He got noticed, though, when he showed up in a barroom wearing a pearl gray derby with an ostrich plume in the band under his arm. That little devil had stuck the shaft of a regular umbrella in the muzzle of the skeleton's weapon. It turned out he'd bought the derby that the storekeeper there had planned to be buried in. Where the ostrich plume came from, I never did find out. He come right in the swinging door and stood there, Hubert said over his shoulder, looking at the crowd. Purty quick they was all looking right back, I can tell you. That feather fetched him up sharp. Take it easy back there, will you, Doc? Bust out laughing. He laughed so hard he bent over double, and the rest of the boys was just beginning to laugh too, when the little feller picked up a spittoon and dumped it down Hamhead's neck. The boys got mighty quiet then. Hey, easy, Doc, will you? Hamhead said, Hey, easy, Doc, will you? Hamhead straightened up, and his face went from red as flannels to white, just like that. He stood glaring at the little fella for a couple of ticks, opening and closing his fists. And then that big right hand went for the Smith & Wesson in his belt. Well, it was a double-action pistol, and he had a couple of notches in the grip, but Hamhead never cleared it. I never even seen the little feller draw, but there was Hamhead falling, with half his noggin shot away, gently leaning on his umbrella, looking down at him. "What was that man's name?" he says. "Hamhead Kavanaugh," somebody says back. "Hamhead Kavanaugh," the little feller says. "He's the first." Then he shoves the umbrella back under his arm. We never saw him again. Some say it was a bootleg pistol he used, or a derringer in his sleeve, and some say he had a partner with a rifle in the street. But there wasn't nobody there. I was standing as close to him as I am to you, Doc, and I swear it was that umbrella. Ow! Ow! Hamhead Kavanaugh was the first. I had kind of a personal interest in Jake and his weapons, so I kept track. There was Curly Sam Thompson, Big John Ballantyne, Red Meat Carson, Uriah Singletree, and 12 others known of, all dead within 18 months, into a fight, with never a chance to get his right hand on iron before his head gave the signal and got blown off. He took them all on, and he never lost, because he couldn't. Jake was king of the hill now, all right. He had the success he yearned for. Well, it wasn't to brag. He was in trouble. I looked up from a customer, a damn fool that had sat on a Gila monster, and there he was, sneaking in the door, bareheaded like a whipped hound, not the cock of the walk in the whole territory. He slid into the back room like a shadow, and the back room like a shadow, and the man I was working on never even knew he'd come. When I went in afterward, the lamp was out, the shade was down, and he was in a corner, nervous as a jackrabbit and eagle just dropped in a wolf den. "Buried my derby under a pile of rock up in the mountains." "Buried my derby under a pile of rock up in the mountains," he whispered. "Look," and he held out his glove. It was plumb worn out. The little metal disc was hanging on by a strand of spirit gum, and the fabric of the palm was in shreds. I looked at him for a minute without hammer coat over BVD tops, but it looked like he'd been buried weeks in it and dug up clumsy. He had on greasy rawhide breeches and battered cowhand boots for shoes. He had a month's beard on his lip, and he stunk. This here was legendary dirty Jake. This here was legendary dirty Jake. No question about it. "Get a new glove," I said. "Nope," he answered. "No good. Last week in Oho Royizo, I took the glove off to scratch, and right then a man braced me. He threw me in a horse trough when I wouldn't fight. I want you to fix me a dingus just under the skin and sew it up again. Knew a fella did that with $5 gold pieces 'cause he didn't like banks. Worked fine till he got a counterfeit and it killed him. I'll lay low in the hills till the hand heals. No problems after that." No problems? Maybe so. But I'd been doing some, kept my mouth shut and did what he wanted, and he slunk off with no thanks. Don't guess I really had any coming. After he left, I got out my tally book and ticked off the men Dirty Jake had killed. One-Eye Jack Sunstrom, Fat Charlie Tignor, Pylander Quantrell, Lobo Stevens, Alec the Frenchman Dubois, some jackass Texas nobody even knew, and the rest. All men whose brains had telegraphed a special signal to Jake's gun before it reached their own right hand. Well, there was a new pistol. A half later, I was craned around, trying to lance a boil of my own, when out of the corner of my eye I saw Dirty Jake go by under my window. He dug that hat with the ostrich plume out from under the rocks. His hand was healed, he was swinging his umbrella, and he didn't so much as look up. He was headed for the Owl Hoot Palace. I decided the boil'd wait. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard the shots, 2 of them. A second later, Jubal Bean, swamper at the Owl Hoot, came pounding up the boardwalk and hollered in the door. "Dog!" Hoot came pounding up the boardwalk and hollered in the door. "Dog! Better come quick! Dirty Jake just took a couple slugs in the chest and he never even got to draw." I took my time. It was just a matter of odds, I said. Who got him? The new one, Jubal said. The man that... Well, a couple more weeks to bleed.